I will never have the depth of many of the people who have lived and have been a part of the cultures that I'm blessed to go to. But I can take a swath of interesting things and make connections and ask unusual questions that then are instructive to new kinds of answers overall. I can bring an analogy they hadn't thought about. I can pull them out of their inbox and have them think about something they had not thought about before. And I think there's a superpower in that.
Welcome to another episode of Outsider Inc. I'm your host, Ian Hathaway. Today's guest is Chris Schroeder, entrepreneur, venture investor, and author, who spent the last decade and a half challenging one of the biggest blind spots in global entrepreneurship. What originated with Italian grandparents at Ellis Island, Chris built an extraordinary career. Harvard, 2 presidential campaigns, a State Department tour under James Baker, Wall Street, private equity, CEO and publisher of WashingtonPost.com, and finally, co-founder of HealthCentral, a community health platform backed by Sequoia, Carlyle, and Barry Diller's IAC, which he grew to over 15 million monthly users and led to a successful exit. But in November 2010, at a startup gathering in Dubai, something shifted. He realized he'd been trapped in his own narrative bias, completely blind to the massive wave of entrepreneurship taking shape across the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. With an insider's track seemingly laid out ahead of him, Chris chose a different path. That awakening led to Startup Rising, the first book on startups in the Arab world, the product of more than a dozen trips to the Middle East and interviews with over 150 entrepreneurs, investors, and global tech leaders across the region. Mark Andreessen wrote the foreword. Chris since co-founded Next Billion Ventures, backed exits like Careem's $3.2 billion sale to Uber, and now chairs the German Marshall Fund. But more than those credentials, Chris has actually been on the ground, repeatedly, logging millions of flight miles to visit places most investors never think about, asking better questions, determined to see what others miss. From the heights of American politics, media, finance, and technology, to the streets of Cairo, Shanghai, and Sao Paulo, Chris's perspective is one that American entrepreneurs and investors desperately need right now. Today, we trace the full arc of his journey, where his curiosity came from, what it took to turn toward the places others overlooked, and what 15 plus years on the road has actually taught him. Chris, welcome to Outsider Inc.
Ian, it's always wonderful to be with you. Thanks for including me.
I want to start somewhere personal. When I was getting ready to launch this show, I asked one person for advice about how to be a great interviewer. And that person was you. Your advice was simple, just to be myself. I'll never forget it because at the time, I guess I was looking for something tactical or more specific, but I feel like what you gave me was far more valuable. I came to you specifically with that question because I consider you to be one of the best interviewers and moderators anywhere. You ask great questions, but more than that, you actually prefer it. You lean into asking questions rather than declaring expertise, which is interesting to me because I also see you as one of the sharpest and most knowledgeable people I know on a range of different topics. I say all of this not as flattery, but as genuine observation that I think can be learned from. So with all of that in mind, you said that the only thing you know for sure that you've achieved is that you ask better questions now than you did in the past. What's the power of the question over the answer?
It's a wonderful question that at one level I have difficulty answering because it's been, I think, part of my nature. My mother thought I was a pain in the ass in my questioning, and so there's a dynamic of it. But I think there is a more concrete answer, and it comes under not only a sense of aspiring to have humility, but humility bred on many, many humiliations. You learn, I think, quite early in life, if you're paying attention, we don't want to be wrong, and so we do everything we can to prove that we're right. When you get knocked out a lot, you start to realize that one of the most powerful things you can do is have almost a wonder or amazement in being wrong, because it helps you to get it right-er. And I had 2 sort of bookends of experience that made me very suspect about expertise. And it does not mean that expertise is not a thing or it's not important, but it has been an exercise in humility again. When I was a kid, you'd mentioned, I was like 22 years old and I worked for Baker at the State Department at this time where the Berlin Wall fell and Nelson Mandela was released. It was a very formative experience for me. And I'll never forget having some of the best experts on Europe and Germany say, for all intents and purposes, that the Berlin Wall will not fall and Germany will not unite anytime in the next 10 years, even though there were a lot of trends happening that people will remember from history. I got a lot of that in October of 1989. And 2 weeks later, the Berlin Wall fell. And a year later, Germany's unified. 20 years later, and I was in the Middle East and at a startup gathering in Egypt after I just had been in Damascus looking at entrepreneurs there. And I was sitting with a couple of very senior American government officials, some very senior Egyptian business people, very sophisticated, very smart, and there were a couple of young entrepreneurs there. This was just the time when the president of Tunisia had left Tunisia and the country changed dramatically. And the question at hand was, could this happen with Egypt? And the experts, the older people there, kind of patted me on the head and said, no, it could never happen here. It's a totally different country. The armies are different. Personalities are different. And I turned to the kids, the entrepreneurs, 26, 27 years old, and they gave what I was later told was an extremely Egyptian answer. They were very courteous to their elders. They were like, oh, no, they know more than I. They have PhDs and everything else. And they paused and smiled at me and said, I don't see why we're that different. And those two young people, of course, were in Tahrir Square 2 days later, and 18 days after that, Mubarak was gone. And so I think it's an anecdotal way and bookended way of saying that if you really, really pay attention, you realize that predicting the future is a fool's errand, that expertise is a never-ending development and experience, and the only way to get better and better at sort of piecing together worlds as an investor, as a citizen, is to embrace humility, to embrace wonder in being wrong, and realizing in the end, the best you'll probably end up is asking better and better questions in service of whatever you care about.
To embrace this philosophy that underpins all of that for you, this wonder of being wrong, was this something that's been with you from the beginning? And then maybe what are things that people can practically do to release this fear of humiliation, of saying the wrong thing, of looking stupid, and embracing that wonder of being wrong?
I learned pretty early on that if I could make people laugh, they embrace the whole kind of circumstance. And so a little bit of self-deprecating humor when you screwed up and to kind of roll with it, you would get kind of a buy-in around you. To this day, there are times when I'm dealing with someone and they're pissing me off and my ego kicks in and I want to prove them I'm right. You never lose it. So I think it's just part of human instinct and there's actually tremendous value in it. But if your North Star is, in some respects, it's almost a question or a word that's always in my mind when I'm processing information, whether it's war now in the Middle East or it's an entrepreneur who's pitching something and trying to convince me that they have a moat against AI. I almost have this voice in my head that says, well, maybe. Now let's unpack it. And I will tell you that I ran WashingtonPost.com in sort of an era where this was one of the core values of the institution. I think it's changed in the news world a lot. And to be surrounded by reporters who were serious reporters, it's not like they didn't have ego, but they were fanatical about getting the story. That was their North Star. And I think that also trained me to have a sense of persistence, but also first things you hear may not be the stuff that will guide you most clearly. But in the end, we're human beings and we have egos and we want to be right. And it's a voice in our head that says, well, maybe, let me pause. And upon what evidence is that true? And you can go from there. The great legendary editor from the Washington Post was a guy named Ben Bradley, who was sort of a legend. He used to have this wonderful line. And so you'd say something to him. He'd look at you and say, interesting, comma, if true. And I think interesting, if true, has been something that's remained with me as a guy who built businesses, as an investor, and a lot of stuff that I do in the policy worlds now.
Oh, I love that. I've got some new material now. What I like to say often to founders and definitely myself on a daily basis is, do you want to be right or do you want to be successful?
I mean, the little secret is you and I know people would rather be right. And that's a tell. You learn something in that.
Yeah, unfortunately so. I feel like too much of the world is consumed with being right rather than being successful. We'll dig into that more in a little bit, but I'd actually like to go back to the beginning for you. You were born in Manhattan's Lower East Side, but grew up outside the city in the Westchester suburb of Scarsdale.
Yeah.
Your grandparents were all immigrants who came to this country with very little. Classic, Ellis Island story, which really became an American dream for you. I know you visited your ancestral origin a couple years ago, tracing your family's footsteps in a small town in the Basilicata region in southern Italy. Why did you go there? And what did that experience do for you?
I've always been extremely interested by history overall, not in some academic, intellectual sense, but in an understanding of what are the things that built us to where we are today, to give a context by which we can see the world. And it's very interesting because I'll talk to people in Silicon Valley, like, I don't care about history, it's all about the future and everything else. And I'm like, you played basketball. when you had your ass kicked last week, did you not learn from that ass kicking and bring it to the next game? But it is a sense of trying to understand why we are where we are. What is the context to it? What are some lessons about leadership or things that have worked or not worked? Where are the rabbit holes that people before me have gotten themselves into and not been able to pull themselves out? And can I keep that in mind without being too overly wedded to it? My family was a typical Ellis Island family from 100 years ago. A swath came from central Italy and then Basilicata, which was just breathtakingly poor at that time. They also came from Naples, from sort of middle class. So it was a Southern Italian story. So we found this little town my grandfather's family was from. And the irony is it's as beautiful a hill town now as you would see in Tuscany. And so you were kind of looking around like, Grandpa, you should have stayed here. It's not so bad. But what really hits you in a sense of the humility is the nearest town was like 10 miles away. And 10 miles away 100 years ago is a universe away. And the idea that this guy at 19 years old, his father and his wife of 17 years old, looked to each other, walking around this town I was walking around, that looked pretty much as it must have then, and looked to each other and said, I have a great idea. Let's leave it all. And they made the decision to go 10 miles to the next town and then 30 miles to a port and somehow or other figure out how to get to New York City. It is a reminder of, one, what I come from, and a reminder of why I think I admire so much that sense of in your teeth, I'm going to solve a problem, whatever it takes. That has been very helpful to me as I've been helping mentoring entrepreneurs.
It's a great story. And the very act of emigrating to a new country is an entrepreneurial act. To no surprise, immigrants in the United States are twice as likely to found companies as native born, partly out of necessity, but I think it's also part of that DNA of someone who's willing to strike it out on their own, start new things. Your parents as well, they were both lawyers, but really, if you dig deeper, they were social entrepreneurs. Your father went to the first concert Leonard Bernstein had ever conducted and eventually founded an organization called Education Through Music because he was horrified that the arts programs were being cut from New York City schools. Your mother, who went to law school at age 18 as one of just 2 women in her class, she spent 50 years building the Caramore Center for Music and the Arts. The family ethos was, if you see a problem, fix it. Not something that was necessarily discussed explicitly, but something that was just lived. How much of your curiosity and your instinct to ask questions like, what do you need? How can I be of help? 2 questions that you always ask me every time we talk. How much of that comes from directly watching their example?
I think a lot came from their example. My mother's father also served in government under LaGuardia in the city of New York. And there was always an ethic that was implicit as much as explicit that if you, as you said, see a problem, you're going to fix it and not just talk about it or sit on the sidelines overall. But it was heavily implicit. They did not sit us down and say, one day go fix things. It really was observing when they took on things as they did, because it's interesting to think of them as social entrepreneurs who spent much of their lives as attorneys, which is not normally thought of as an entrepreneurial venture. And I think in some odd way, seeing what their parents had been through, certainly the Depression weighed on them, World War II was a part of them. I think that they were this balance between also the immigrant value that you become a lawyer, engineer, doctor, or whatever it is, which was in their environment, but also saying, look, we've got some stuff, and with that stuff, we should fix things. But I can't remember a single time where we had a conversation about it. It was merely that you just kind of understood it and you unpacked it and you find something that you cared about. My father has always adored music, was raised very much in that tradition, but he could not stand, because to him, the data was crystal clear that schools that had good arts and music programs, kids' performance in that school academically and in test scores, the R square was like 9.2. And yet these were the first places getting cut. And so he came up with this idea of education through music so that they could help fund arts programs and have kids exposed to music as a way not only to enjoy that in and of itself, but to build some additional musculature that was very valuable. It became very large. It's a problem that may never be solved, but he certainly contributed a tremendous verse.
Discovering problems, highlighting their existence, and doing something about it. Feels like that's what you've spent most of your career doing. So switching gears a bit on that, something that I don't really get a chance to discuss on this show, the DC policy world. I spent time working in the DC policy arena during my career, so I have a bit of a window into that. You, of course, did as well. During and after college, you worked inside of the Bush presidential campaigns, and then at the State Department, you worked under legendary diplomats like James Baker and Robert Zoellick, mentors who undoubtedly had a huge imprint on you as well. But that world also taught you about something else. It taught you about transactional relationships, people who were your best friend until you left office. I'm curious what impact that realization had on you, particularly since the world of entrepreneurships and ecosystems that we're both operating in and thriving in today is famously the exact opposite of transactional thinking.
I don't want to be overly sanctimonious about this. If we're in business, there's a transactional element to what we do. We try to sell something and we try to convince someone. You pitch a venture capitalist, there's a transaction to that. And so I don't want to blanket it as problematic. But what I learned starting in those days as a kid, and I've seen it among the best that I've dealt with in the business world since, is that there's a real distinction between people who come to you solely for the transaction short term, and if you don't deliver it, they move on, and someone who wants to engage with shared interest and shared outcomes of interest with a view that this could be a lifetime engagement. And it's not always a lifetime engagement, but the nature of it is great. I know a lot of people in the policy world and globally, and certainly in the business, venture capital, and VC worlds. And I can almost tell within 10 minutes why somebody's meeting with me. And I know that they're trying to get to somebody or they want my money or whatever it is, that kind of stuff. And there are other people where it's the beginning of an engagement, of understanding in an almost of service way. What are we trying to do here? And what are we going to be doing over time? And maybe this time there will be a transaction, but if not, there will be another transaction another day. And we should just be under that kind of level of connectivity, under the thesis of good people knowing good people. A lot more great outcomes come, whether they're monetary or structural or just impact as we define it. And it was very, very clear to me very early on that the best people I saw were not hyperly transactional. And in fact, when they got reputations of being about the transaction, they may succeed, right? It's staggering to me how some people who I thought may not succeed end up doing very well because they're so good at the transaction. They go, 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 go. But they're known for who they are, and they're not liked, and people don't necessarily want to do business with them. Whereas there are these people who have just become legends and have done amazing things, and they really have that balance down, I think, in a very powerful way. And that inspired me, I think, a great deal.
So I think what you're saying is it's not just that you want to engage with people through the mechanism of a relationship rather than purely transactional. It is, in fact, that in most of these cases, in these industries, I point out the example of tech and entrepreneurship, which I think is inherently collaborative. But even in politics, it can come back to bite you unless you're truly exceptional. It's not just about personal taste. Over the long term, in most contexts, it's a better way to get where you want to be.
I had a great sales executive in my life who mentored me a lot of times when I had sales problems in companies I invested in. We'd have this conversation. It sounds almost pedantic in its obviousness, but he would say to me, don't ever forget people want to buy from people that they want to buy from. I think the fundamental construct that let's figure out if there are win-wins together and let's kind of go at it does not mean that we're not transactional, does not mean that we don't want to make a lot of money. It doesn't mean that I may want to beat you from time to time, but it's an arc of understanding. And I will say you touched on this, and you and I have talked about it a lot, because not only has it been exciting, I think one of the really better things one can say about Silicon Valley and American entrepreneurship writ large, but I think you and I have seen it replicated in other markets of the world. It's extraordinary the generosity of time that entrepreneurs show to each other, and the best of the venture capitalists show. And they're not looking for an immediate hit because of that. I mean, they may realize that someday it could work out into something else, but it's almost a cultural instinct. We will all get each other through this absolutely ridiculous and absurd thing called entrepreneurship that we all know 90% of them are going to go to zero, and we've all felt it, and we've all been there. So let's lock arms. And that is a magnificent and I think very genuine thing that often gets lost when people like to point fingers. They miss, I think, what you articulated so well.
One of the things you were describing there reminds me of Annalise Saxenian's famous collaborative competition framework. You were on a podcast with her and Brad Feld. I've listened to that numerous times. I love that framework that really it's this collaborative competition. It's not that we're not competing against each other. It's that we're putting the cause, the mission of advance above even our own short-term interests at times. And that's what keeps the ecosystem vibrant and sustaining.
It's so interesting because the best entrepreneurs you and I know are also killers. They are steely focused. They want to win. You can slow them down. You cannot stop them. When we think about the super builders that you and I know, and we've been fortunate enough to fund a few of them, it's not 100%, but a lot of them I don't really want to hang out with. I don't think I would have liked Henry Ford a whole lot. I don't think I would have liked JP Morgan a whole lot. But the fact of the matter is they built a lot with their tenacity and their killer instinct and transaction. But if you were to look at the arc of it overall and the kind of life you want to live and the success you can still build, I still defer to the things that you and I have just been sharing.
Departing from your time in politics, you went to business school back at Harvard, where you went to undergrad, then into banking, private equity, corporate leadership. You became CEO of a company called Legislate, a B2B platform covering federal and state legislation, which you ultimately sold to the Washington Post in 1999 after working to bring the company into the online world. I should also mention, somewhere in all of that, you had a successful DJ business, that things were going great until they weren't. On the back of the Legislate sale, you were tapped to become CEO and publisher of Washington Post Newsweek Interactive at the age of 35. An enormous job at a relatively young age, a truly transformational time for the media business as it faced the tidal wave of the digital age. First, set the scene a little bit for what it was like to build a digital media company during the time of the dot-com boom when things were moving so quickly. And then secondly, what was the core lesson of trying to build something entrepreneurial inside of such a large and storied institution?
You know, it's amazing. Yeah, I think back 15 years ago, we got it to 30 million, seemed like very big numbers, and they seem like nothing today. But they were big numbers at the time. And there were a lot of things that we experimented on that was making a case, which leads to your question, which is that there was going to be a significant paradigm shift in the way people engaged with information. We were one of the first partners with Google, so we had a frontline understanding of how people behaved when they had the ability to find what they want, when and how they wanted to find it, how people wanted to share information, how people aggregated truth. The idea that you go to one destination to know how the world works had evaporated before I even got there. So you had all these dynamics, but when you think about those dynamics, as I just rattled them off the top of my head, every one of those was a threat to the paradigm of the legacy business. The legacy business was based on the idea that you were a monopoly as a business. If you're at the Washington Post and you had this juggernaut monopoly local news and information sector, advertisers had no choice but to come to you. And now all of a sudden we're in a world where I used to do this in meetings with the newspapers. I'd show every section of the newspaper and rattle off 20 competitors of every subsection of that thing to wake them up that it was going to be a very different paradigm. And while I think I was right on the substance of what was happening, that doesn't mean that people loved you for it. And there were a lot of people who wanted to understand it, and they were incredible co-authors. And there were a lot of people who I think in many respects, either one, wanted to squash it, or two, which one executive said to me at Time Warner at the time, he said, I know all this stuff is happening. I just want it to happen after I retire. It's amazing to me that because we had this flurry of news startups maybe 5, 7, 8 years ago, and you had Vox and you had BuzzFeed and all that, and everyone said, that's it, like the traditional news is over. And in point of fact, almost all of them are dead, and traditional news people are struggling for a whole host of reasons and a lot of things that are happening with the diaspora of information. But I think you asked about lessons. One is change happens slower than you think often, not always, but I can't tell you the number of VCs at the time who said, newspapers and news will be dead in 3 years. And that did not play out that way. But the second thing, in a way, was a personality thing, because I sort of lucked into this role. And I love the news. I'm very interested by it. I was a huge consumer by it. I thought it was important, and I thought we could make it into a very big business. But when I began to observe these structural ankle weights and the shuttle diplomacy that you described before, I actually, most importantly, learned something about myself. We see entrepreneurs a lot, and on occasion, people who are very successful in a large organization with a large balance sheet and so on, who do pretty well there, kind of should stay there. Being an entrepreneur is just substantially different than being an entrepreneur. And I looked at myself in the mirror and said, I want to build my own things. And I have a lot of ideas and theses now how to do it, and I cannot be in that position. So when I broke off with some folks to do the HealthCentral thing, I remember a board member from the Washington Post pulling me aside and said, what are you doing? Are you crazy? The odds of this are very low, and what are you doing? And I said to him, look, it may not work, but I've been dying to do this. I've had it in my teeth for years. I was an entrepreneurial kid. I'm going to do this, and there's no going back. And I said, more importantly, no matter whatever goes wrong, no one is ever going to say to me, don't do that because you might hurt print advertising. And he just cracked up. I mean, he got it right away. And to be an entrepreneur means a willingness and a personality type to navigate legacy that has a very different set of values and incentives. And if you are of that nature, you should do it. And I think many large organizations, particularly now in the AI world, who are going to find themselves very threatened, will need that kind of capability instinct. Barry Diller would never have lasted a second. Mark Zuckerberg would not have lasted a second. Pick whatever great entrepreneur, they would not have lasted a second in that environment at that time. By the way, I think Diller learned that because Diller did rise within very big media companies. And when he did IAC, he could very well have taken over another studio yet again. And he's like, I don't want that. I want to build something that was never there before. And it's a different musculature and it's a different mindset. And I would add, by the way, my first year as an outright entrepreneur was probably the shittiest year of my career in terms of my own performance. I realized that I had to up my game in a very different way. It wasn't work ethic. I always worked 80 hours a week. It was mindset and getting out of me the DNA of legacy that made me have some better success eventually.
Especially in this era of AI, I think understanding the inner mechanizations of legacy industries is going to be particularly valuable and important. A couple episodes ago, we had Hernan Caza, who's one of the co-founders of Mercado Libre. He talked about how his time at Procter & Gamble, he was a brand manager working in marketing before Stanford Business School, before Mercado Libre. He felt very constrained in that environment. But then when it came time to scale Mercado Libre, he actually started leaning on some of those very processes that annoyed him as a young man. Are there ways, perhaps surprising ways, that now you look back on it, or times when your experience in that role actually helped you as an entrepreneur?
No question that at a certain level of scale, you understand that there are things that need to be done operationally, accountability and so on, which are very important. But I will say at the same time, it is much better in a way to understand the importance of that at scale, but to make sure you're doing it in the most efficacious and often new ways. The thing which doesn't change as much, I think, is at a leadership level, meaning I don't think people change that much. I wish I understood this at 30 the way that I understood it at 50. If you understand the incentive structure you put in place in almost any operation or organization, you could pretty much predict with 95% certainty how people are going to behave. So the idea of that learning in a large enterprise of how, in the end, I watched lots of people do things that actually at one level made no sense to me. But then when you understood the incentive structure, they made perfect sense. Understanding that mindset and being a realist about what motivates people and where they will behave to incentive, what is the kind of talent you want or not want. I don't have any question that some of the more established stuff reminded me of that.
The incentives one is a powerful learning. There's something that I ask entrepreneurs all the time, which is, do you know how your ICP, your ideal customer, gets their Christmas bonus? It's a simple question that they almost never have the answer to, but ultimately you're selling to a person who has incentives that may be different from the organization and certainly different from yours. Give all the credit in the world to my partner, Jonathan, for seeding me with that thought. Shifting gears, you leave the Post and you join an investor group along with legendary investors like Mike Moritz at Sequoia Capital, Alan Spoon at Polaris Venture Partners, Carlyle Group, Allen and Company, and eventually Barry Diller's IAC to acquire and essentially rebuild from scratch a company called HealthCentral, where you are the CEO and founder. I know that thesis for HealthCentral was personal for you, and you had seen how these online communities of people going through the same thing were helping save each other's lives. It's very clear your why, but it had to be a big adjustment for you. What was it like going from leading the company that we just talked about with this household name recognition, but with a lot of unwanted structure for you, to then being the CEO of this company that most people had never heard of before?
We inherited a few assets, of which HealthCentral was one, and we elevated the brand. So we weren't trying to relaunch it because we had a very different thesis. But what became very clear to me was the world did not need another WebMD, an encyclopedia of health. They had very precise questions with very precise ideas of what they wanted to be. And one, we should be delivering to those needs at scale. And two, that one of the most foundational needs that I learned in the personal experience that you talked about is that if you can talk to someone who's like you, going through what you went through and what they did worked, then you were going to absolutely replicate it. And technology would allow that experience to scale. In a way, for me, it was the ultimate definition of empowerment. When I see someone like me do something that works and I do it, is an act of empowerment. And so I said, there's no way WebMD is going to do this. These other sort of encyclopedias of health weren't going to do it. Harvard had their own website. There's a cacophony of information that in many respects I think I underestimated. But we realized that if we could start matching people, it could be very powerful. And the second thing that was very specific about that was the journey was not about let's get anybody with breast cancer to a site. The thesis was, if I have an illness, what I want is someone who looks like me, acts like me, is in my background. And the questions I'm asking are not yet one more question about different kinds of drugs or treatment, though that's a part of it. It's like, when do I tell my children? Or do I tell my children? Or I'm going to go talk to my parents. Do I tell my parents this? By the way, I need some time off from work. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. How do I think about it? And it was only when you talk to people who had been there that those rich conversations became so profound. And so that's what we tried to organize at scale. And there was a business model to it. It was very, very clear to me that if we could get the right advertising message, you would literally say, I'm someone who is struggling with this condition, whatever it was. And then all of a sudden, all I'm seeing are ads that are related to what I'm thinking about. Those ads were no longer an interruptive annoyance. They, in fact, were content. And because of that, we were able to charge much higher CPMs, and it performed well.
The company achieved its mission. It saved lives, right? You've talked about that. You grew to over 15 million monthly users, integrated 5 acquisitions, and ultimately you sold the company to Remedy Health in late 2011. What went into the decision to sell the company then? And when you stepped away from something that you had spent 7 years building, particularly something that was so personal to you, so mission oriented, I can hear it in your voice about how valuable that innovative construct that you introduced about how people can engage with information and content around something that is threatening their lives. What did it actually feel like for you to let go of the company at that time?
We had been building for about a year and a half different strategies about how to accelerate the growth. We got very close to acquiring a very large enterprise that would have changed the dynamics of the company very well. We actually had discussions about a merger with another enterprise that we would have split things pretty evenly and had a great CEO would have come in. I could have been chairman. And there was plenty of debate in the company. Let's go it alone because the trajectory is good. And all of a sudden, we met an unbelievable CEO, just amazing guy who really understood our vision, who was working for this company called Remedy Health that had a tremendous data and traditional content. And it was a perfect fit. And after negotiating it and going through both personal and intellectual exercises, they made an offer that was by far and away the best offer of how to think about building for the future. I think by that time in that process, my mental outlook was what's best for this enterprise going forward. But I really felt that at that time in the competitive environment, one, we needed better scale faster. And secondly, we got an offer that was a great offer, and that we all looked at each other and said that was the right thing. But then all of a sudden, the emails got smaller and the phone calls became less, and you start realizing, well, all right, now it's time to do something else. There is a mourning in it, but the mourning was subjugated to this was a very good outcome for the enterprise and for a lot of people, and now let's see what we can do next.
Speaking of that, I'm excited to get to what I think may have gotten you out of that mourning period. Up to this point, you had an impressive track record, Harvard, State Department, Washington Post, Sequoia-backed founder with Mike Moritz on your board. You had a clear pathway to stay inside of that world. I mean, who knows? You maybe even could have been an investment partner at Sequoia. But instead, in November 2010, before the acquisition, you go to Dubai. You said that at the time you weren't super thrilled about that trip. In fact, you were giving a keynote speech that wasn't exactly relevant to what you were doing. But within a few hours, your life changes completely. There were thousands of young entrepreneurs, another 3,000 on the waiting list. You realize that you've been maybe stuck in your own narrative bias and missed this movement entirely. Walk us through that experience. What happened to you there in Dubai that changed your life in the span of just 2 hours?
There was a dull roar to that particular event in Dubai because, like every kind of gringo CEO at that time, I outsourced technology to every emerging market you can mention, from Argentina to Sri Lanka, right? Because it's very easy to get high quality, great engineering at a fraction of the cost by doing so. But unlike, I think, a lot of my gringo sisters and brothers, I actually visited some of my partners. And when you got on the ground, you realized almost instantly, and Hernan would be an example of this in Mercado Libre, these people did not want to spend their lives selling cheap engineering to people like me. They had in their teeth all these problems they knew that had already been solved elsewhere and could not understand why they weren't being solved in their backyards. Mercado Libre is a perfect example of this, which is really why at the end of the day, Amazon may come here, they may not, but quite frankly, who's better to create the Amazon of Latin America than us? And even in the Middle East at that point, there was not an Arabic email. And so all these young generation who were very well aware of what the internet was doing in English and all the juggernaut activity that had begun with Microsoft and beyond in Silicon Valley began to ask this central question, why not us? And then there was a second question, which is, if everyone has a supercomputer in their pocket, which was gradually happening, that meant, one, talent is everywhere and now you could unleash it. And two, I can deliver new services that leapfrog the traditional ones or the ones that never existed at all. And I just saw these conversations over and over again. Anyway, in parallel of this, friends of mine who were really leaders in the tech ecosystem in the Middle East, in the Arab world, I mean, everyone knew about Israel and some amazing companies that came from there. No one in America thought anything like this was happening in Egypt or Jordan or Lebanon or whatever, certainly not in the Gulf in those days. Saudi Arabia was completely locked off, and the UAE just looked too expensive to do something like this. And most Americans, that if you asked them about the Middle East, their answer would have been about ISIS or terrorism and so on. And I remember someone saying to me, he said, there are maybe 30,000 ISIS and maybe 150,000 people who support them. And the region is 350 million. Wouldn't you like to know what other people are doing in the meantime? And it woke me up so that when they had this conference, the first major gathering of startups in the Arab Middle East, I was curious and I wanted to do it, and I had no bandwidth to do it because we were in the process of having sale discussions, everything else. And they pretty much said, as a friend, would I do it? And you're not wrong in what you said, because within 2 hours, I had been rewired of being there because it was 3,000 young people who did not want to talk about any of the geopolitical stuff. They could not have given a damn about any politician talking about anything. They were incredibly sophisticated and creative about the problems they were solving. They knew exactly what they were. They asked me better questions than sometimes I got from people here. They had different problems than I would normally see in Silicon Valley. And it was very, very clear to me that this question of when the world has massive access to supercomputing, the whole idea of business, the whole idea of society, the whole idea of innovation, the whole idea of unleashing talent was going to become completely different than anything that happened in my year. And so at that time, I did have opportunities to work in venture capital and particularly EIR, because I thought I'd go and build another company from scratch. But I got sucked in more and more to this question, because I thought if I could understand this question better, I'm going to understand something that most people don't. And this is where the world is going, and I should start focusing my time. So the lens became the Arab Middle East. But of course, what I saw there, I eventually saw very quickly in Southeast Asia and Latin America. And China is Exhibit A. China was all of this on steroids. I mean, nothing drives me crazier when Americans then and now talk about these places as copycats. They miss that these companies had familiar themes to successful Western companies, but they had certain clarity about things that were cultural, technological, language, how people behave, how they use money, what their experience base was, last mile logistics that was going to give them incredible innovation edge in the companies they made. And the journey just went from there.
You got sucked in. Ultimately, it culminates in you writing this book, Startup Rising, which was the first book on startups in the Arab world. I know you made more than a dozen trips to the region.
Yeah, a lot more.
Yeah, interviewed hundreds of entrepreneurs in the region from all across the region.
Yeah. It's
a great book. I've read it more than once. There were lots of amazing nuggets in it. I think about this term I learned from that book, wasta, that you introduced, at least into my life. I apply it in lots of contexts. Wasta is not just a Middle Eastern thing. It applies in lots of different pockets of society.
Yeah, I'm in Washington, D.C. It's like the ultimate wasta city.
Yeah. So wasta, for those who don't know, is really about this notion that you can't get ahead unless you're connected into the right networks, which is true in lots of different places we just discussed. But really, these success stories that were coming out of the Middle East just prove that. It's not just about knowing the nuts and bolts of building a product company and scaling. It's the inspiration, the fact that, oh, this could be true for me. If that person can do it, so can I. Just tell us a little bit about the book coming together and what the initial reception was. When you came back and explained to people what you were seeing, what was the reaction? Were people skeptical? Did they think that you were onto something, or did they think you were a little bit crazy?
I think a little bit of all of the above. I mean, why would you write a book at all? I had not written a book before. I had blogged a lot, and I had written magazine articles in Wall Street Journal and stuff like that. And very often it was in service of me clarifying my head. I realized that as I process a lot of information, if you distill your thinking to 750 words, it's hard to bullshit yourself, right? You need to really get to the essence of what you're trying to say. And The idea of writing a book was that what I observed seemed so big and so important and such a case study of this bigger question that selfishly, if I spent a year going back and forth and reporting it, I would organize my thoughts. And then it became clear to me if I did that, it would be not just a series of articles, which I did do at that time for a bunch of different groups. Kara Swisher and others recruited me to write pieces about what I saw while I wrote it. Those pieces became part of the outline of what was a book. And obviously, Andreessen wrote the introduction because he was not making any predictions, but he even said in the foreword, this could be $1 trillion question that needs to be looked at in a different way. So I think when I came back, first of all, anyone who I met in Silicon Valley or even here who either came from the Middle East or came from a rising market, they felt like I was preaching to the converted. They understood it. They knew it. They just couldn't believe no one was really focusing on it. But a whole swath of people, but it wasn't just Washington, it was like, it's a waste of time. Like, there's no way on earth this is real. I remember a top journalist at the Washington Post who published an op-ed that I wrote from one of those trips. Initially, his first reaction is, I've covered the Middle East for 20 years. There's no way this is real. And I just walked him through it and I reported him. I'm not a Middle East expert. I'm literally telling you what I saw and how technology is changing dynamics. And he took it and became a big supporter of it. So it was a journey, I think, of education and pushback. Some people embraced it and some people just didn't. And I think the old narratives die hard.
That was more than a decade and a half ago. Since then, you haven't stopped. If anything, you're accelerating this curiosity of yours about entrepreneurship and innovation around the world. Next Billion Ventures, investment committees across the Middle East and Southeast Asia, the German Marshall Fund. You fly hundreds of thousands of miles a year, and you've backed exits like Kareem's $3.2 billion sale to Uber. I consider you someone who is extremely knowledgeable about the global tech ecosystem. And yet, as we sort of just discussed, like, the label you've chosen for yourself is not expert or authority. You've called yourself an in-and-out gringo, a gringo CEO, the first person to say that no matter how many trips you take or how many books you read, you still don't know enough. I think that's real humility in an era where I wish more people had that level of humility. Most people with your stature and experience might not do that. They lean the other way. But you keep reminding yourself of what you don't know, your desire to question rather than tell. How do you think that's improved the work you do in your life, more so than people who have decided that they've already figured it out?
I must say there are many people in my life and career who would not describe me as humble. I make mistakes in my arrogance on a regular basis. It's more of an exercise in humiliation. It's a beautiful thing of being my age and you're younger, but the difference between being 22 and 52 is you've been knocked around. And you can either make a choice that you get knocked around and you want to get off the field, or you get knocked around and therefore you've seen it all before and you have all the answers. Or you can say, I got knocked around, so I'm smarter. And now let me go dig through it. Having said that, I am deeply humbled when I go on the ground. The minute I start thinking I'm getting a handle, particularly on a place. But the thing that you have done a lot, Brad Feld has done a lot, and I've tried to replicate you guys in a way, is that while I will never have the depth of many of the people who have lived and have been a part of the cultures that I'm blessed to go to, I have a very unique pattern recognition by putting together trends of things in the intersection, firstly, of different kinds of countries and seeing how different stages look at. I also think I have a tremendous amount of depth by also understanding how the intersection of technology, business, and policymaking has never been greater before. And that is also instructive. I am not a great public servant. I am not the deepest person on China. I sure as hell can't stand toe-to-toe with the greatest of Chinese expertise. But I can take a swath of interesting things and make connections and ask unusual questions that then are instructive to new kinds of answers overall. I've also brought comfort in understanding that I will never understand with real depth what other people have in the areas where they've been either focused on, they live, they come from. But I can bring on obvious connections, and often the questions I ask are not only helpful in my curiosity or helping me refine thesis because I come from a different lens. I'm very helpful to other entrepreneurs. I can bring an analogy they hadn't thought about. I can pull them out of their inbox and have them think about something they had not thought about before. And I think there's a superpower in that. It's just a different musculature that has its own value.
I feel like you bring this journalistic lens into so much that you do. I know your background with Washington Post was business, but it is a journalistic company. Mike Moritz, who was on your board at HealthCentral, famously a journalist.
Michael and I used to talk about this. He actually was not officially on the board, but honestly, he was as accessible and helpful as if he were on the board. I learned unbelievable amounts of things from him. But early on, when we were knowing each other, and I did write periodically thoughtful pieces to help clear my head, he turned to me once and said, look, you've got to make a choice here. I understand that this writing is service of your action, but do you want to be a writer or do you want to build? And I said, I want to build, but I got to tell you, my bullshit detector is in the writing. And he smiled and he said, I get it. I get it. But it was a good pushback. And it was a reminder you can sort of convince yourself the things that you do are in service. And lo and behold, as you know very well, great entrepreneurship is an exercise in focus. And you got to be careful of what's serving what in the different ways you approach problem solving or question asking.
100%. Switching gears a little bit, also building on another journalist friend of yours from Jerusalem gave you this term that I know you enjoy, the third cappuccino syndrome. I want to ask you, can you tell us about what is the third cappuccino syndrome? And more importantly, are we in a third cappuccino moment right now?
She would argue that that is an element of human nature, that we're always in the risk of a third cappuccino. And it, of course, you and I could now rattle off examples of why this is true today. And the essence of it is how easy it is for us, all of us, to get spun up about something and then get comfortable in the environment and move on. And I think in many respects, that very human instinct is on steroids now in the world of social media and AI, because it's very, very easy to get spun up and to get value at saying, I tweeted X or I put whatever it is on Instagram and therefore I've done my duty and hurrah. And then 2 weeks later, nobody's talking about a thing. And the definition of entrepreneurship is persistence in many ways. You can't just sort of show up and say, I made a statement and move on. And yet there is a desire among a lot of us to do that. She's a magnificent journalist, and she's taught me a lot about that, written amazing books also. And this first experience hit her when she was covering Jerusalem, probably would have been 2006 when there were attacks going on. And she'd say, it hit me very, very clearly that the war could be here, not far away. And then you go look and the cafes are filled and the restaurants are filled and people want their third cappuccino. It's like a very natural human instinct to do it. The upside of it is it gives us a sense of survivability and appreciation that when things are uncertain, we can still grab onto something that we enjoy and love. But the bad thing is what I alluded to before, is that there's a complacency in it. There is a substitution of enjoyment and moving on quickly to the next thing, and not the persistence that big and thorny problems require. I can remember being in Italy years ago, and there'd be all these headlines about Berlusconi taking over and making the country more fascist. And you'd go and literally in Lucca, and you'd go into Florence, the cafeterias are filled and the restaurants are great and the energy is great. And I totally get the instinct and share the instinct for that third cappuccino. But I think there's a real cautionary notice of that. It's true in entrepreneurship, and I think it's absolutely true in our willingness to stand up for things that we believe in any element of society.
You once told a story about an Endeavor meeting where a dozen or so entrepreneurs from Latin America, Africa, and Asia sat down with their Chinese counterparts. And afterwards, they told you, look, the Chinese tech community understands us so much better than the American tech community does. Because when the Americans show up, they tell us how to be like Silicon Valley companies. But when the Chinese see us, they expect us to be great Indonesian entrepreneurs or Brazilian entrepreneurs or Nigerian entrepreneurs. So from your perspective, what does it actually mean to engage founders on their own terms? And why does Silicon Valley keep getting this wrong?
This story, which was a very profound story, crystallized many experiences I had. You described it perfectly well. These were growth stage companies, all fintech companies. Some of them had hit very large multi-$100 million revenue bases and were on a good trajectory, many of whom were coming from regions in Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America, where 80% of the population never been banked before, and literally we're now learning about what it was like to do financial transactions on a phone. So it's sort of an extraordinary thing. And what you realize, generally speaking, is that when you sit with an entrepreneur from Jakarta or from Cairo or from Sao Paulo, and they are trying to solve a similar problem, it is amazing how they share very clear questions that you would never hear in Silicon Valley. So, for example, you would hear, literally, 80% of my country has never been banked before. How do I educate people about what it means to bank and to move money and that kind of stuff? How do you navigate last mile logistics, where in many parts of my country, there are actually no addresses, but I need to think about how do you do that? Regulation's changing all the time. Politics is changing all the time. How do I think about this? I mean, all of a sudden, there's like a list of questions that have unique cultural and political and language differences, but are strikingly not only similar, But they are questions that almost invariably would never come up in a Silicon Valley venture capital meeting. And so here I am in Hangzhou with Ant and Alibaba, some of the most senior people there with these great companies. And I literally just sat back and watched because this was a conversation of rising market to rising market. And China, of course, 15 years earlier, was an emerging market too. So they spoke the language perfectly. They completely understood the questions that were being asked. And I watched literally one conversation form with four major regions of the world where 80% of that conversation would never have been included in a pitch in New York City or Silicon Valley. And it just hit me. There's tremendous opportunity in that, but there's also a lot of shared learning. And that, needless to say, people in a place like China had a knowledge base and an understanding that was going to serve them very, very well in a world where, 80% of humanity was being unleashed by a supercomputer. And yes, the entrepreneurs love to give me shit about this. And I must say to you, it was two Mexican entrepreneurs who really gave me the gringo lecture about how much the Chinese are smarter than anyone they ever met in Silicon Valley solely because of this thing. And they were funny about it, but they weren't wrong.
Speaking on China, I remember a couple of years ago, you spent a significant amount of time in China. You wrote extensively about this on Substack. Those were highly engaging articles. I recommend anyone out listening to read those. You mentioned before we started recording that you're going back to China again soon.
Yeah.
What is it that you learn by being on the ground in a place like China? What question is it that you're most hoping you can answer on this upcoming trip?
I think the difference of being on the ground and not on the ground is night and day. I have friends in Silicon Valley and elsewhere who are more than happy not to travel that much, and they aggregate incredible amount of information. They're very informed on the world. But the fact of the matter is when you're on the ground, you can watch behaviors and you walk into stores and you talk to cab drivers and you talk to translators who have 11-year-old children and how they're thinking about AI. It is a very different exercise. I will tell you at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, entrepreneurs have a few beers. You have a very different conversation than you'd ever have on Zoom. And it's just unbelievably refreshing and helps me reframe things. There are two fundamental things which I absolutely optimize for in understanding where our world is going for whatever time I have left in the world. And they are AI and China. I don't think there are going to be any two issues that I could name that will have greater significant impact in the way the world will function holistically going forward. And some of those will be threats and some of those will be opportunities. And we have no idea what leadership will be like in 5 years. But to me, they are the most central historical shifts. And in fact, in the case of AI, I think we are wrestling with something that has no precedence. This is not some new technology. This is a capability that allows us to think in ways that were simply never possible before. In the case of China, this is the first time in American history since World War II where we have to deal toe-to-toe with an extraordinary, powerful, not only country with capability, but a culture of many thousands of years. We have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to coexist? And are there opportunities to co-author? And if not, we still have to default on coexistence. I could spend every traveling day of my life between now and the next whatever years I have left, and I will still not have a drop in a bucket of understanding a place like China. But I think it is incredibly worthy for people to get on the ground because I think you see things differently, you understand things differently, you have a sense of how people view you there, and that gives you room to maneuver. And I think we're living in a world now, whether it's in technology or business or geopolitical, where there's tremendous amount of instability and uncertainty, and at the same time, unbelievable opportunity to do things that you and I could not have fantasized about 5 years ago, to say to ourselves, are we jumping down simple answers in complex areas? Are we deferring the complex questions to have a third cappuccino? Or are we doing the work it takes to help to be proactive and intentional in building the world as it's coming? And I have found being on the ground is very powerful. So to your specific question, I try on the trips to China, I'll always go to Beijing and Shanghai and Hangzhou and places like that because they're very much in the sweet spot. I do not invest in China. I will not be investing in China, though, of course, China looms large in the markets you and I care so much about. But I also am trying to get out of the what I'll call the gringo corridor and see other parts of China. On this last trip, I went to Xi'an, which is a second-tier city, obviously has tremendous history, but I also have friends there who really walked me around and we talked about day-to-day life in Xi'an a little bit. I went to Nanjing because history means a great deal to me, and it was a very, very significant cultural moment of horror in what happened in World War II there, so I wanted to understand that. Are young people still thinking about that? It gives me a different lens on it. This trip, I'm going to go to Sichuan and I'm going to go to Chengdu and to Chongqing. There will be business people that I meet that will be interesting and what have you. But, most Americans don't realize that these are these are cities of 30 million people. And I want to see something that's outside of the corridor where I'm usually most comfortable and kind of watch. The worst case scenario is I'm going to see interesting stuff and eat very well. But I have found in every trip that I go to, I come out thinking significantly differently than I felt going in.
I want to end where we began with this idea of asking the right questions. Because right now there's something I'm wrestling with internally. You mentioned AI and China being the defining moments of the day, but I'm thinking about the country that you and I are both in right now as we are recording this. We're genuinely in a strange moment for America's role in the world, including for America's relationship with the global entrepreneurship community. We're at war with Iran. Our relationships with traditional allies, long-standing relationships, are strained. The Chinese tech community, as you described it, understands emerging markets founders better than we do. I've seen it firsthand in Latin America, Asia, and Eastern Europe. And yet, this is also the country that defined high-tech entrepreneurship, right? That produced the most transformative technology companies in history and really invented the social and cultural blueprint for how to create an environment for innovation and entrepreneurship to sustain, to thrive. So given everything that you've seen on the ground in so many places, being an American, but really a citizen of the world, what are the questions that American entrepreneurs and investors should be asking right now that almost nobody is asking?
It's such a powerful question. There are many situational elements of it, but I would tell you a couple of things. One is an environment and uncertain times with things changing as rapidly as they are, and with technology compounding it. In many ways, one of the biggest things to do is breathe and say maybe and ask questions. The act of being able to breathe and to ask the question and now have tools available to say, is this actually true? Do we really have evidence of this? Or are we acting as if we have evidence of this? Is an incredible opportunity. It also has been something psychologically helpful to me. This ability to sort of say, is this true? Is it possibly true, but we don't know yet? So let's breathe. Is it helpful to me, even if it is true, is, I think, a tremendous opportunity that not just entrepreneurs, but all of us can bring to bear in a system that right now that rewards political polarization on each side and not a lot of latitude and freedom to be able to pause and breathe and ask those questions. And I think it also compels us through incentive to be very short-term focused and the ability to sort of say things are the way they are now. And I must say, Ian, I think there are a lot of cards on the table now that have been laying on the table for years. We may not have wanted to look at them for what they are, but I think the rise of China, there's a lot that we hadn't really thought about before. The idea that 90% of Europe's energy would come from one country, everyone kind of knew it, but didn't look at it. The idea that all of us wake up with 95% of our chips and the most advanced chips coming from one island. I mean, we have this ability to ask questions that have been brewing and are not just of the last year or 18 months, but have come to roost in a way that's very important. That approach, I think, can be very powerful, whether we're thinking about politics or society, but is a very, very similar approach to the companies that you build. Because I think a lot of times, and I see this a lot, not just internationally, but very much in American entrepreneurs, is they have all the buzzwords down, but they're not actually telling me a problem that they will solve over time for which they have a sustainable moat to do so. And there's a first principles element in everything I've just talked about that I think each of us individually can bring to bear, not only in the questions that we ask, but the way we think about and frame them.
It's a great perspective. I'm definitely concerned. I feel like in so many ways we are on our sixth cappuccino, not really dealing with the fundamental issues in front of us, too busy being enraged.
It's real. I'm with you. Can I wrap just on two hopeful elements that come from the same space? And they're not enough to counter your worry and my worry. I hope nothing I've said does not suggest that I'm not concerned about where these moments can go, because I tend to be a very hopeful man in the Václav Havel sense, but I also know that I'm enough of a historian to know how things can go in other ways. But I got to tell you something. My youngest works for SpaceX. And when you tour SpaceX, it's hard to articulate how moving that experience is. Again, this does nothing to do with personalities. It has to do with being a mile-long facility where people from all walks of life are building things that you and I could not have fantasized about in high school and college. And it's moving, and it's a reminder. And I'm sure you watched, and I know I was glued and literally teared up watching the launch of the first human craft going to the moon. Maybe it's a version of the third cappuccino, but I don't think so. I think this is a reminder to us that there's so much actually that we can do. And the craziness that we're dealing with and the things that people want to focus on, what is problematic about AI, we will cure cancer with this thing. And so it is a good reminder, I think, to me, as something of a counterbalance, knowing full well that if you counterbalance too much, all of a sudden you're on your third cappuccino. So we have to be alert and attending to the worry that you and I think, share in many ways, and remind ourselves of the unbelievable things that we do at big scales, like going to the moon. But also, you and I could probably rattle off right now, if we had more time, 10 human beings we saw this week who are doing such impactful things for their communities or for their families. And that's very powerful and not to be lost track of.
That's a very optimistic way to wrap the conversation. I agree with that wholeheartedly. But before I let you go, here on Outsider Inc., we like to finish with a little segment called Beyond the Bio. These are just some quick answer questions that go beyond your resume and let us dig into you. Sound okay?
Sure. Great.
All right, let's do it. What's a quick piece of advice from a mentor that stuck with you throughout your journey?
God, I've gotten so many of them overall, but I think Harold Tanner reminded me often about the long-term power of relationship building. In many ways, he was the first guy many years ago who really showed me in action, indeed, the difference between transaction and long-term relationship engagement.
Well, I can see you've embodied that throughout your life and career. Who is an unsung hero in your life, and what has been the impact they've had on you?
I think people often will talk about older people as unsung heroes and all, but my kids are my unsung heroes. They have very different drummers. They have done things in very, very different ways and have different passions. They've taught me unbelievable things about those passions. And they're circumspect. They are humble. They're incredibly funny and self-effacing. And they are reminders to me to stay focused on things that matter and the way that we can be helpful to each other.
Who's someone in your local startup community or in your broader network who doesn't get enough credit and deserves a shout out from you?
Man, there's just so many courageous entrepreneurs. I really can't single them out. Like you, I talk to 3 entrepreneurs probably a day. 80% of them blow me away in what they do and the courage. I would say that there are several that have stuck to their guns in places of impossible calamity, sometimes in the Middle East and Syria, refugees who I've met in other parts of the world. They have that perseverance. You can slow me down, but you can't stop me. And this is the opportunity for me to build something helpful in a moment. I have a special place in my heart for them.
Tell us something most people don't know about you, something outside of work. Could be a hobby, favorite travel spot, a guilty pleasure, or maybe even a hidden talent.
I'm not sure I've got that much in talent, but you touched on something parenthetically that surprised people, generally speaking, which was earlier than when you suggested. In high school and college, I was, in fact, a DJ. If people think that I was the cool thing that we think of DJs today, I want you to think of the greater New York City area of weddings and bar mitzvahs, because that was kind of it.
Oh, that's great. Well, building off of that, what are 1 or 2 songs you'd like to add to our Spotify Founders playlist? Maybe something that fuels your workday or it has inspired you on your journey as an entrepreneur.
I am a fanatic of music and I like many things overall. I wrote my book to Bach and I love jazz and I have dear friends who have shared that. And I love a lot of the current music now, particularly in areas of hip hop. And I will tell you that I think some of the most interesting hip hop storytelling and flow is coming from Asia and particularly Korea. Lee Young-ji is one example of it. But I will tell you that through Ben Horowitz, who has created this incredible thing called Paid in Full, he has built an enterprise that has helped give economic support to the kind of the founders of the hip hop generation, people that I think a lot of kids don't know anymore. Quincy Jones did this for jazz artists because, you know, many of the geniuses who built jazz in the 40s and 50s, 60s ended up homeless. No one remembered them and whatever. This has happened with the pioneers of rap and hip hop in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s. And so when I listen to someone like Rakim, who people my age will remember, but a lot of kids don't, it's poetry. I mean, his word and flow is poetry. In fact, he was very inspired by jazz saxophone and tried to replicate that in his flow. And there's not a great rapper today, Chance the Rapper or Kendrick, who would not tell you Rakim was foundational to who they are. And so folks like that, their music is incredibly inspiring to me. Then your entrepreneurs would love one of the epic songs of Rakim was Paid in Full. And so you can play that one.
All right, we'll add it. I know you are an insanely voracious reader, so this question is almost impossible, but let's give it a shot. What's a book you'd recommend? Maybe something that's been especially valuable to you on your journey, or one you think every first-time founder should read as they're getting started?
I read over 100 books a year, and my goal is 150, which I didn't quite hit last year, but I've tried to do. Look, I mean, there's a tactical answer to your question from a founder perspective. Ben Horowitz's books, both of his books on culture and the hard things were unbelievable. Our friend and hero, Brad Feld, has written amazing books. You've written an amazing book about entrepreneurial ecosystems and also kind of a handbook of how to think about things, which I think are very powerful. But I really think in the end that the best books, quote unquote, to help entrepreneurs are in history and biography, and to understand perseverance and how people think and how human behavior is, and also to try to aspire to get more of a bottom-up view of where the world is going. So very concretely, in preparation for my last trip to China late last year in November, I read, 25 books on China, and most of them were very good. A couple of them were exceptional. But the one that jumped out was the book, I Deliver Parcels in Beijing. And the book was written by a Chinese gig worker who had a blog for many years that got fanatically valued in China, and he turned it into a book. And literally, he had like 18 jobs in 8 years, and he was literally delivering parcels, but he also worked on warehouse floors. The book is extremely poignant in that it talks about how hard that work is and the expectations of not being able to go to the bathroom and other things. It's very funny. There were stories that were hilarious. But it was an incredible reflection about how I think about work. Like, do I want to be 996? My parents want me to be an engineer. I don't want to do that. Everyone says a young guy should be 996, which is the Chinese way of working very hard. I don't want that. Maybe my gig life, for all of its problems, fits the kind of life I want to live, or does it? This incredibly poignant view, not from China experts telling you about China and economy, but what are real people on the ground navigating? I just couldn't get enough of it. It was a brilliant, brilliant book, and it changed me in many ways.
That sounds incredible. I'm going to check that out. I also agree with you. Obviously, Brad Feld, amazing writer. Ben Horowitz, I love his book, What You Do Is Who You Are. Even the statement, the book is amazing. The stories in that book are incredible, but just that statement is something I try to think about often. And history, right? So the book I try to read every day is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Marcus Aurelius, good for you. And no surprise that you say that. I swear to you, what a wonderful thing, because if every entrepreneur had that on their end table, they should not take their foot off the pedal one iota, but they'd be more circumspect about what their day brings.
Fantastic book. Okay, so last question, Chris. If you could give one piece of advice to someone who's about to start their first company today, particularly someone who's a bit of an outsider, what would it be?
You need to have a problem that you want to solve it in your teeth. You can't imagine not solving the problem or grab the opportunity that you want. And in parallel with that, you know more about that problem and activity than almost anyone around you, and never, ever be intimidated by money. I can't tell you the number of entrepreneurs who go meet venture capitalists who'll come to me like, well, the guy's rich, so he must know something I don't know. If you have a great idea, the money will come. And if you don't, it may not. But this idea that if you get to meet with Sequoia, then all of your problems are solved and you'll be great forever is a story we tell ourselves in the head that have no bearing on the actual outcome of what you have. Money matters, and having people around you who can shore up your weaknesses can be additive. But there's a courage in sort of saying, I will not be intimidated by money, and I will focus on this thing that I can't imagine not solving.
That's a great perspective, certainly a unique one that we've had on the show. I can't think of a better way to end. Chris, thank you so much for being here and sharing your time and wisdom. I'm so excited to share this episode with our listeners.
Honor to be with you, and you're a great friend, so thank you.
That's a wrap for today's episode of Outsider Inc. A big thank you to Chris Schroeder for bringing his curiosity and candor to the conversation. What stays with me most isn't the impressive resume. It's the choice Chris made in Dubai to abandon the path he seemed destined for and instead chase the questions most people don't ever ask. He traded certainty for curiosity, expertise for exploration, and spent 15 plus years discovering what most others miss. Chris reminds us that the most powerful position you can take isn't declaring what you know. It's admitting what you don't. That humility isn't weakness, it's a superpower. That being wrong isn't failure, it's the first stop on the path to getting it right. And that the best investors, builders, and leaders aren't the ones with all the answers. They're the ones still asking better questions. For outsiders listening, get on the ground. Challenge your narrative bias. Don't miss what's actually happening while you're sipping that third cappuccino. the next billion-dollar insight might be waiting in a place you never thought to look. If you want more from Outsider Inc., don't forget to subscribe to the platform at outsiderinc.substack.com. It's packed with highlights from today's episode and bonus insights you won't want to miss. You can follow Outsider Inc. on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn at Outsider Inc. Pod. You can also follow me on X at Ian Hathaway. Outsider Inc. is produced by Spellbinder Media. We'll be back soon with another fascinating outsider conversation. Until then, thank you so much for listening, and remember, great entrepreneurs can come from anywhere. See you next time.